in the frozen wasteland of the Eastern Front during World War II, where temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius and death lurked behind every snowdrift, there emerged a figure so deadly, so precise, and so utterly terrifying to the enemy that they would eventually place the largest bounty in military history on her head. But here's the twist that would make your blood run cold. This wasn't some grizzled veteran or elite military operative. This was a woman who, just months before, had been sitting behind a desk, filing paperwork and managing office supplies. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, but the world would come to know her by a different title entirely: Lady Death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1941, and Nazi Germany had just launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million Axis troops were pouring across the Soviet border, bringing with them a level of brutality and destruction that the world had never seen. Cities were being reduced to rubble, entire populations were being systematically exterminated, and the Soviet Union was fighting for its very survival. In this chaos, millions of ordinary citizens were called upon to do extraordinary things. But none would prove more extraordinary than a 25-year-old history student from Kiev named Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Lyudmila had grown up in a small village outside of Kiev, the daughter of a factory worker and a teacher. She was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, with a mind sharp enough to cut glass and a memory that could retain the most minute details. As a child, she had shown an unusual interest in military history, devouring books about famous battles and legendary warriors. Her friends thought she was odd for preferring these dusty tomes to romance novels, but Lyudmila found something deeply fascinating about the art of warfare, about the strategies and tactics that separated victory from defeat. But perhaps even more unusual was her hobby. While other girls her age were learning to sew or cook, Lyudmila had convinced her father to teach her how to shoot. Not just casual target practice, mind you, but serious marksmanship. She would spend hours at the local shooting club, learning to control her breathing, to steady her hands, to calculate wind speed and bullet drop with mathematical precision. By the time she was a teenager, she could put a bullet through the center of a target at distances that made seasoned hunters shake their heads in disbelief. When she entered Kiev University to study history, her professors were impressed by her analytical mind and her ability to understand complex military strategies. She seemed destined for a quiet life as an academic, perhaps eventually becoming a professor herself. She even took a part-time job in a government office, filing paperwork and managing administrative tasks, the kind of mundane work that would later inspire her enemies to mockingly call her the paperwork lady. Little did they know that this seemingly ordinary young woman was about to become one of the most feared snipers in military history. The morning of June 22, 1941, changed everything. Lyudmila was awakened by the sound of air raid sirens wailing across Kiev. She rushed to her window and saw something that would be burned into her memory forever: German bombers darkening the sky like a plague of locusts, raining death down on her beloved city. The invasion had begun, and within hours, it became clear that this wasn't just another war. This was a fight for the very existence of her people, her culture, her way of life. As refugees began streaming through the streets and reports came in of entire towns being wiped off the map, Lyudmila made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Instead, she walked straight to the nearest military recruitment office and volunteered for active duty. The recruiting officer took one look at this slight, bookish young woman and tried to steer her toward nursing or administrative work. After all, what could a college girl possibly contribute to the war effort? That's when Lyudmila mentioned her shooting skills. The officer was skeptical, Claims like this were common among new recruits, eager to impress, so he decided to test her. They set up a target at 100 meters, handed her a rifle, and waited for the inevitable disappointment. Instead, they witnessed something that would become the stuff of legend. Lyudmila didn't just hit the target. She obliterated it with a precision that left seasoned marksmen speechless. Shot after shot found its mark with mechanical consistency, each bullet hole forming a tight cluster that could be covered with a single coin. The recruitment office fell silent. Officers exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that they weren't dealing with just another eager volunteer. They were looking at a natural-born killer, someone whose unique combination of intelligence, patience, and deadly accuracy could potentially turn the tide of individual battles. Within days, Lyudmila found herself being fast-tracked through sniper training, where she would learn the deadly arts that would soon make her the most feared woman on the Eastern Front, the Soviet sniper. School was unlike anything Lyudmila had ever experienced. Located in a heavily fortified compound outside Moscow, it was a place where ordinary soldiers were transformed into instruments of death, where every lesson could mean the difference between life and a bullet to the head. The instructors were men who had already seen combat, grizzled veterans whose eyes held the cold stare of those who had looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. They were not impressed by Lyudmila's academic credentials or her performance at the recruitment office. Here, in this place where survival was measured in fractions of inches and split seconds, book learning meant nothing. The training was brutal, designed to break down every instinct for self-preservation and rebuild it into something far more deadly. Students learned to remain motionless for hours at a time, fighting off hunger, thirst, and the basic human need to move. They practiced controlling their heartbeat, slowing their breathing to almost imperceptible levels, and calculating complex mathematical equations while under extreme stress. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to kill without hesitation, to see the enemy not as fellow human beings, but as targets to be eliminated with cold, clinical precision. Lyudmila excelled at every aspect of the training. Her academic background gave her an edge in understanding ballistics and weather patterns, while her natural shooting ability allowed her to consistently outperform recruits who had been hunting since childhood. But what truly set her apart was her psychological makeup. While other students struggled with the moral implications of what they were learning, Lyudmila approached each lesson with the detached analytical mind of a scholar studying historical battles. She understood that this was war in its purest form, kill or be killed, with no room for sentiment or hesitation. The instructors began to take notice. Here was a student who not only absorbed every lesson, but improved upon the techniques they taught. She developed her own methods for camouflage, created more efficient ways to calculate long-distance shots, and displayed an uncanny ability to predict enemy movement patterns. By the time her training was complete, even the most hardened veterans were referring to her with a mixture of respect and unease. They had created something unprecedented, a female sniper whose skills rivaled or exceeded those of the most elite. Male marksman. In September 1941, Lyudmila was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division and deployed to the siege of Odessa, a strategic port city on the Black Sea that had become a crucial battleground in the fight for Ukraine. The city was surrounded by German and Romanian forces, and the fighting was intensifying with each passing day. Buildings were reduced to rubble by constant artillery bombardment, and the streets ran red with blood. It was here, in this hellscape of urban warfare, that the paperwork lady would claim her first kill and begin building a reputation that would strike fear into the hearts of enemy soldiers across the entire Eastern Front. Her first assignment was reconnaissance, observe enemy positions, identify high-value targets, and report back to command. It was supposed to be a relatively safe introduction to combat, a way to ease new snipers into the realities of warfare. But as Lyudmila settled into her concealed position overlooking a bombed-out square, she spotted something that made her blood boil. A German officer was executing captured Soviet civilians, lining them up against a wall and shooting them one by one, while his soldiers laughed and took photographs. This wasn't reconnaissance anymore. This was personal. Lyudmila steadied her rifle, controlled her breathing, and calculated the distance, approximately 400 meters. The wind was minimal, the target was stationary, and she had a clear line of sight. As she centered the crosshairs on the German officer's chest, time seemed to slow down. This was the moment that would define everything that followed, the split second that would transform a university student into one of history's most deadly snipers. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect. The German officer crumpled to the ground, dead before he hit the pavement. The other soldiers scattered in panic, desperately seeking cover and trying to locate the source of the shot. But Lyudmila was already gone, having slipped away through the ruins with the silent grace of a phantom. Her first kill had been achieved with clinical precision, and more importantly, it had saved the lives of several innocent civilians who would have otherwise faced execution. Word of the mysterious sniper spread quickly through both armies. The Germans began posting additional sentries and implementing new security protocols, while the Soviets started receiving reports of enemy officers being eliminated with surgical precision. But nobody yet knew the identity of this ghost-like marksman who seemed to appear out of nowhere, claim another victim, and vanish without a trace. Over the following weeks, Lyudmila's kill count began to climb steadily. She eliminated German machine gun nests, picked off officers during strategy meetings, and created such an atmosphere of fear that enemy soldiers became reluctant to expose themselves in areas where she might be operating. Her methods were varied and unpredictable. Sometimes she would strike from extreme distances. Other times she would infiltrate deep behind enemy lines for close-range eliminations. Each kill was planned and executed with the methodical precision of a chess master, and each one brought her closer to a reputation that would eventually make her the most wanted woman in the Nazi war machine. As autumn turned to winter and the siege of Odessa intensified, Lyudmila's reputation began to spread beyond the immediate battlefield. Stories of the mysterious sniper who could strike from impossible distances and vanish without a trace were being whispered in trenches across the Eastern Front. German soldiers started referring to her as der Geist, the ghost, never knowing that their phantom tormentor was actually a young woman who, just months earlier, had been filing paperwork in a government office in Kiev. The psychological impact of her presence was becoming almost as devastating as her actual kills. German officers found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, afraid to move openly during daylight hours. Radio communications became increasingly paranoid, with reports of the mysterious sniper being exaggerated and embellished, until she took on almost mythical proportions in the minds of enemy troops. Some claimed she could shoot through walls. Others insisted she could hit targets from over a mile away, and a few even suggested that she might not be human at all. But the reality was far more terrifying than any myth. Lyudmila was very much human, but she possessed a combination of skills, intelligence, and ruthless determination that made her more dangerous than an entire platoon of ordinary soldiers. She had learned to think like her enemies, to predict their movements and anticipate their strategies. She studied their uniforms, their equipment, their daily routines, and their psychological weaknesses with the same analytical approach she had once applied to historical research. Her methods were constantly evolving. She realized that traditional sniper positions, rooftops, church towers, obvious elevated locations, were too predictable and dangerous. Instead, she began operating from ground level, using rubble piles, abandoned vehicles, and even sewage systems as concealment. She would sometimes spend days preparing a single shot, studying her target's habits and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Other times, she would execute rapid-fire ambushes, eliminating multiple targets in quick succession before disappearing into the urban maze of destroyed buildings and collapsed streets. One incident in particular began to establish her legend. A German colonel had been terrorizing the civilian population of Odessa, using captured Soviet citizens as human shields and executing anyone suspected of cooperating with the resistance. He was careful to surround himself with bodyguards and rarely appeared in the same location twice, making him an extremely difficult target for conventional military action. But Lyudmila saw him as just another problem to be solved through careful observation and mathematical precision. She spent 3 days studying the colonel's movements, mapping out his security protocols, and identifying patterns in his behavior. She noticed that every morning at precisely 9:15 a.m., he would step onto a second-floor balcony of his commandeered headquarters to review written reports from his subordinates. The balcony offered him a clear view of the surrounding area, but it also exposed him for approximately 90 seconds, just long enough for a skilled marksman to line up the perfect shot. On the 4th morning, Lyudmila was in position. She had chosen a location over 600 meters away, concealed within the ruins of a bombed-out bakery. The shot would require her to account for wind speed, bullet drop, and the slight elevation difference between her position and the target. More challenging still, she would have only one opportunity: miss, and the colonel would never expose himself again. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the colonel stepped onto his balcony. Lyudmila controlled her breathing, steadied her rifle, and made her final calculations. The crosshairs settled on their target, and she squeezed the trigger with the gentle pressure of a lover's caress. The bullet traveled for nearly 2 seconds before finding its mark. The German colonel dropped instantly, killed by a shot so precise that it entered through his left temple and exited cleanly through the opposite side of his skull. His bodyguards rushed to his aid, but it was far too late. Another enemy of the Soviet people had been eliminated, and once again, the sniper responsible had vanished without a trace. This kill marked a turning point in how both armies viewed the mysterious marksman. The Germans began offering rewards for information leading to the sniper's capture, while Soviet command started receiving requests from other units, asking for this legendary shooter to be transferred to their sectors. But Lyudmila remained focused on her mission, treating each kill not as a personal victory, but as a mathematical problem successfully solved. As her confirmed kill count reached 30, then 40, then 50, German intelligence began working frantically to identify their tormentor. They analyzed bullet trajectories, interviewed survivors, and even brought in their own elite snipers to hunt down this phantom killer. What they discovered shocked them to their core. Preliminary evidence suggested that their most feared enemy might actually be a woman. The idea was almost incomprehensible to the German military leadership. Women, in their view, were supposed to be nurturers and homemakers, not cold-blooded killers capable of eliminating seasoned combat veterans with surgical precision. The possibility that a mere female could be responsible for demoralizing entire regiments and forcing major tactical changes in their military operations was both humiliating and terrifying. But as more evidence accumulated, the truth became undeniable. The Soviet Union had unleashed something unprecedented upon the Eastern Front, a female sniper whose skills and psychological impact were unlike anything the German war machine had ever encountered. Soon, they would learn her name, and when they did, they would place the largest bounty in military history on her head. By November 1941, the siege of Odessa had reached a critical point. German and Romanian forces were closing in from all sides, and it became clear that the city could not be held indefinitely. Soviet command made the difficult decision to evacuate their forces to Sevastopol, another strategic port that would become the site of one of the longest and bloodiest sieges in military history. For Lyudmila, this meant leaving behind the urban battlefield where she had claimed her first victories and adapting to an entirely new environment, one that would test her skills in ways she had never imagined. Sevastopol was a fortress city, built on rocky cliffs overlooking the Black Sea. Its defensive positions had been carefully constructed over decades, with underground bunkers, hidden artillery emplacements, and maze-like tunnel systems that could shelter thousands of defenders. But these advantages came with their own challenges for a sniper. The rocky terrain offered excellent concealment, but limited mobility, while the constant artillery bombardment created a hellscape of smoke, dust, and flying debris that could interfere with even the most precise shots. It was here, in this crucible of destruction, that Lyudmila would truly earn her fearsome reputation. The German command had learned from their experiences in Odessa, and were now specifically hunting for the mysterious sniper who had caused them so much trouble. They brought in their own elite marksmen, men who had trained for years in the art of counter-sniping and who were equipped with the finest rifles and optical equipment that German engineering could produce. The first of these hunters was Hauptmann Klaus Weber, a Bavarian aristocrat who had won shooting competitions across Europe before the war and who boasted a confirmed kill count of over 60 enemy soldiers. Weber was convinced that no Soviet marksman, regardless of skill, could match the superior training and equipment of the German military. He had studied the reports from Odessa and developed what he believed was a foolproof strategy for eliminating this troublesome sniper once and for all. Weber's approach was methodical and patient. He spent days studying the Soviet defensive positions through high-powered telescopes, mapping out likely sniper nests and identifying patterns in the defenders' behavior. He noticed that the mysterious marksmen seemed to favor positions that offered multiple escape routes and that kills often occurred during periods of heavy artillery bombardment when the sound of rifle shots would be masked by explosions. On a foggy morning in December, Weber thought he had found his opportunity. He had identified what appeared to be a sniper position in the ruins of an Orthodox church, where broken walls and collapsed masonry provided excellent concealment while still offering clear fields of fire. Through his scope, he could just make out the outline of what looked like a rifle barrel protruding from behind a chunk of fallen stonework. Weber steadied his rifle, controlled his breathing, and prepared to claim what he believed would be the most significant kill of his career. But as he centered his crosshairs on the suspected position, something made him hesitate. The target seemed too obvious, too easy. In his years of experience, he had learned that the best snipers were masters of deception, and this felt like a trap. His instincts were correct. The rifle barrel he had spotted was actually a carefully positioned piece of metal pipe, designed to draw the attention of enemy marksmen, while the real sniper operated from an entirely different location. Lyudmila had anticipated that the Germans would send their best hunters after her, and she had prepared accordingly. She had been watching Weber for over an hour, studying his movements and waiting for him to reveal his position. When Weber finally took his shot at the decoy target, Lyudmila was ready. She had calculated the trajectory of his muzzle flash and had already adjusted for wind speed and distance. Her return shot was instantaneous and devastating. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, the pride of the German sniper corps, was dead before his own bullet finished its flight toward the empty church ruins. The psychological impact of Weber's death rippled through the German forces like a shockwave. Here was one of their most skilled marksmen, a man who had never failed to eliminate his target, killed by the very sniper he had been sent to hunt. Word spread quickly through the ranks that their mysterious enemy was not just lucky or opportunistic, but was actually a tactical genius capable of outthinking and outmaneuvering Germany's finest soldiers. German commanders responded by sending even more elite snipers to Sevastopol, each one convinced that they would succeed where Weber had failed. But Lyudmila was evolving faster than they could adapt. Each encounter taught her new lessons about her enemy's methods and psychology. She began leaving false clues and misleading evidence, creating elaborate deceptions that would draw German hunters into carefully prepared kill zones. Her confirmed kill count continued to climb: 75, 85, 100. Each number represented not just another enemy soldier eliminated, but another victory in the deadly game of cat and mouse that was being played out across the ruins of Sevastopol. German intelligence officers were becoming desperate, analyzing every piece of evidence they could find and trying to build a psychological profile of their tormentor. What they discovered was deeply unsettling. The pattern of kills suggested someone with advanced mathematical training, possibly an engineer or academic. The tactical sophistication indicated formal military education, while the psychological warfare technique suggested a deep understanding of human nature. This was not some peasant with a rifle, but an intellectual adversary who was using the tools of warfare with the precision of a scientist conducting experiments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As winter deepened and the siege of Sevastopol entered its most brutal phase, German intelligence finally managed to piece together the identity of their most feared enemy. Through intercepted radio communications, testimony from captured Soviet soldiers, and careful analysis of battlefield evidence, they learned that their tormentor was not only a woman, but a former university student named Lyudmila Pavlichenko. The revelation sent shockwaves through the German high command. The idea that a young woman, someone they mockingly began calling Die Bürofrau, or the paperwork lady, based on her previous administrative job, could be responsible for the deaths of over 100 German soldiers was both humiliating and terrifying. It challenged everything they believed about female capabilities and threatened to undermine the morale of their entire Eastern Front operation. If word spread that a single Soviet woman was out fighting their best male warriors, it could have devastating psychological consequences for the German war effort. The response was unprecedented. German command placed a bounty of 100,000 Reichsmarks on Lyudmila's head, equivalent to nearly $500,000 in today's currency, and the largest individual bounty in military history at that time. They launched massive propaganda campaigns depicting her as a bloodthirsty monster, a perversion of natural feminine instincts who had been corrupted by communist ideology. Radio broadcasts warned German soldiers about the White Death of Sevastopol, describing her as a phantom killer who could strike from impossible distances. But the propaganda had an unintended effect. Rather than demoralizing Soviet forces, it actually boosted their morale tremendously. Here was proof that one of their own, a young woman who had volunteered to defend her homeland, was so effective that the enemy was willing to pay a fortune just to eliminate her. Soviet newspapers began publishing stories about their legendary sniper, carefully omitting tactical details while emphasizing her courage and dedication to the motherland. Lyudmila herself remained focused on her mission, treating the bounty and propaganda as merely additional factors to consider in her tactical planning. If anything, the increased attention made her more careful and methodical. She knew that every German soldier in Sevastopol was now looking for her, that counter-sniper teams were being specifically trained to hunt her down, and that her survival depended on staying one step ahead of increasingly sophisticated enemy efforts. She began employing even more advanced psychological warfare techniques. Sometimes she would deliberately miss high-value targets, allowing them to live while eliminating their subordinates, creating paranoia and mistrust within German command structures. Other times she would leave cryptic messages at kill sites, mathematical equations or literary quotes that demonstrated her education while simultaneously mocking German assumptions about Soviet intellectual capabilities. One particularly elaborate operation demonstrated the full extent of her tactical genius. German forces had established a heavily fortified observation post on a hilltop overlooking Sevastopol's harbor, using it to direct artillery fire against Soviet supply ships. The position was protected by multiple layers of defense, including machine gun nests, barbed wire, and roving patrols. Conventional military assault would have required significant manpower, and would likely have failed due to the position's natural advantages. Lyudmila studied the German post for weeks, identifying patterns in guard rotations, supply deliveries, and communication schedules. She noticed that every third day, a motorcycle courier would arrive with intelligence reports and new orders, always taking the same route up the hillside and always arriving at approximately the same time. This courier represented a vulnerability that could be exploited, but it would require perfect timing and extraordinary marksmanship. On the designated day, Lyudmila positioned herself nearly 800 meters from the observation post, concealed within the wreckage of a destroyed Soviet tank. The shot she was planning would be one of the most difficult of her career. Not only was the target moving at high speed, but she would need to time the elimination to create maximum psychological impact on the German defenders. As the motorcycle courier rounded the final curve before reaching the observation post, Lyudmila made her calculations. Wind speed, target velocity, bullet drop, and timing all had to be perfect. She led the target by several meters, accounting for the time that would take her bullet to reach its destination, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot was extraordinary. The bullet struck the courier in the head just as he was waving to the guards at the observation post, killing him instantly and sending his motorcycle careening off the hillside in a spectacular crash. But this was only the beginning of Lyudmila's plan. The courier had been carrying detailed intelligence reports that would reveal sensitive German positions and troop movements, intelligence that Soviet forces desperately needed. While the German defenders rushed to secure the crash site and recover the classified documents, Lyudmila was already moving to her second position. As German soldiers exposed themselves while searching through the wreckage, she methodically eliminated them one by one. By the time reinforcements arrived, 6 more German soldiers were dead, and the intelligence reports were in Soviet hands. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers began to believe that their enemy possessed almost supernatural abilities, the power to strike from impossible distances with perfect timing, and to predict their movements with uncanny accuracy. Morale plummeted, and many soldiers became reluctant to volunteer for missions that might expose them to the legendary snipers. As her confirmed kill count approached 200, Lyudmila had become more than just a sniper. She had become a symbol of Soviet resistance and German vulnerability. Her exploits were being reported in newspapers around the world, with Allied publications celebrating her as proof that the Nazi war machine could be defeated by courage and determination. Meanwhile, German propaganda was working overtime to minimize her achievements while secretly increasing security measures and counter-sniper operations throughout the Eastern Front. The siege of Sevastopol was entering its final, most desperate phase. German forces had been pounding the city for months, reducing most buildings to rubble and forcing defenders into underground bunkers and cave systems. Supplies were running critically low, casualties were mounting, and it was becoming clear that the fortress could not hold out much longer. But even in these desperate circumstances, Lyudmila continued her deadly work, adapting her tactics to the increasingly harsh conditions that the constant artillery bombardment had created a moonscape of craters and debris that actually worked to her advantage. The broken terrain provided countless hiding spots and concealment opportunities, while the dust and smoke from explosions helped mask her movements. She learned to time her shots with incoming artillery rounds, using the sound of explosions to cover the crack of her rifle. She even began using the underground tunnel systems to move between positions, emerging at unexpected locations to claim her targets before vanishing back into the subterranean maze. One kill during this period would become particularly legendary among Soviet forces. A German general named Friedrich von Kleist had arrived in Sevastopol to personally oversee the final assault on the fortress. Von Kleist was known for his arrogance and his habit of exposing himself unnecessarily, believing that his rank and reputation made him immune to enemy action. He had publicly dismissed reports about the Soviet sniper, claiming that no woman could pose a serious threat to properly trained German officers. Von Kleist's overconfidence would prove fatal. During a briefing with his subordinates near the front lines, he insisted on conducting the meeting in an exposed position despite protests from his security detail. He wanted to demonstrate his fearlessness to the troops and show that he was not intimidated by Soviet propaganda about their legendary marksman. Lyudmila had been tracking the general's movements for days, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. From her concealed position over 700 meters away, she had a clear shot at the arrogant German commander. But rather than taking the obvious target, she made a decision that demonstrated both her tactical brilliance and her understanding of psychological warfare. Instead of killing von Kleist immediately, she first eliminated his aide-de-camp with a precise shot to the chest. The young officer dropped instantly, sending the entire group diving for cover. Von Kleist found himself pressed against a concrete barrier, trapped and helpless while his legendary enemy held him at her mercy. For several agonizing minutes, he waited for the inevitable bullet that would end his life, but it never came. Lyudmila deliberately let him live, allowing him to crawl away in humiliation while she eliminated 2 more of his officers with clinical precision. The message was clear. She could have killed the general at any moment, but chose to spare him so that he could live with the knowledge of his own helplessness. The psychological impact was devastating. Von Kleist never again exposed himself during the remainder of the siege, and his visible terror spread throughout the German command structure. By May 1942, Lyudmila's official kill count had reached 309 confirmed kills, making her the most successful female sniper in history and one of the deadliest marksmen of any gender. Each number represented a small victory in the larger struggle for Soviet survival, a demonstration that the seemingly invincible German war machine could be defeated through skill, courage, and unwavering determination. But the physical and psychological toll of her service was becoming increasingly evident. Months of constant combat, limited sleep, and the stress of being hunted by enemy snipers had pushed her to the breaking point. She had survived countless attempts on her life, endured artillery bombardments that killed soldiers just meters away, and witnessed the deaths of many friends and comrades. The young woman who had once filed paperwork in a Kiev office had been transformed into something harder and colder, a precision instrument of death who calculated human mortality with mathematical detachment. Soviet command recognized that their most valuable asset was approaching exhaustion. Reports from field commanders indicated that while Lyudmila's skills remained sharp, her judgment was becoming increasingly reckless. She was taking unnecessary risks, perhaps driven by a death wish or simply by the accumulated trauma of months in combat. The decision was made to evacuate her from Sevastopol before she could become another casualty of the siege. In June 1942, just weeks before the fortress finally fell to German forces, Lyudmila was evacuated by submarine and transported back to Moscow. Her active combat career was over, but her impact on the war effort was just beginning. Soviet leadership had bigger plans for their legendary sniper. Plans that would take her far from the battlefields of the Eastern Front and into the halls of power in Allied capitals around the world. The paperwork lady, who had terrorized German forces for nearly a year, was about to become something even more dangerous, a symbol of Soviet resistance and a powerful weapon in the propaganda war that would help determine the ultimate outcome of World War II. When Lyudmila arrived in Moscow in the summer of 1942, she expected to be reassigned to another combat unit or perhaps given a role training new snipers. Instead, she found herself thrust into an entirely different kind of warfare, the battle for international public opinion that would prove just as crucial as any military campaign. Soviet leadership had realized that their legendary sniper could serve as a powerful symbol of their nation's determination and capabilities, helping to secure vital support from allied nations who were still hesitant about their communist ally. The transformation from combat soldier to propaganda symbol was jarring for someone who had spent the past year living in trenches and ruins. Suddenly, Lyudmila found herself measured for dress uniforms, coached by speechwriters, and scheduled for photo sessions that would be distributed to newspapers around the world. The Soviet press machine went into overdrive, crafting a narrative that emphasized both her deadly effectiveness and her essential humanity. She was portrayed as a devoted patriot who had taken up arms only to defend her homeland from fascist invaders. But the most significant part of her new role would come in the form of an unprecedented diplomatic mission. In August 1942, Lyudmila became the first Soviet citizen to be officially invited to visit the United States, as part of a delegation designed to strengthen the alliance between the two nations. The trip would be both a diplomatic triumph and a personal ordeal, as she struggled to adapt from the brutal realities of combat to the polished world of international politics. The journey to America began with a perilous flight across the Atlantic, dodging German U-boats and fighter patrols that would have loved nothing more than to shoot down the aircraft carrying the Soviet Union's most famous warrior. When she finally arrived in Washington, D.C., Lyudmila was greeted with a reception that reflected both American fascination with her story and deep uncertainty about their communist ally. American media coverage of her visit revealed the complex attitudes of the time. Many newspapers celebrated her as a heroic figure who had struck powerful blows against Nazi Germany, but others struggled with the concept of a female killer, even when fighting for the Allied cause. Some publications focused on her appearance and demeanor rather than her military achievements, describing her as surprisingly feminine or not what you'd expect from a deadly sniper. These attitudes became even more apparent during her public appearances. At press conferences, male journalists would ask condescending questions about her makeup routine or whether she had ever considered more traditional feminine roles. Lyudmila's responses were sharp and cutting, delivered with the same precision she had once applied to eliminating enemy targets. When one reporter asked if she found it difficult to powder her nose on the battlefield, she replied coldly, "I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" Her most significant American appearance came at a rally in Chicago, where she spoke to a crowd of thousands about the realities of war and the urgent need for increased Allied support. The speech was a masterpiece of propaganda, carefully crafted to emphasize shared values while highlighting the desperate situation facing Soviet forces. She described the courage of ordinary citizens who had taken up arms to defend their homes, the sacrifices made by soldiers fighting against overwhelming odds, and the importance of international cooperation in defeating fascism. But perhaps more importantly, her presence in America served to humanize the Soviet war effort for audiences who had been conditioned to view communism with suspicion and fear. Here was a young woman who had volunteered to fight for her country, who had demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire, and who spoke passionately about defending her people against foreign invaders. Her story resonated with American values of individual heroism and resistance to tyranny, helping to build public support for increased aid to the Soviet Union. The diplomatic impact of her visit was significant. American military leaders who had initially been skeptical of Soviet capabilities were forced to reconsider their assumptions when faced with concrete evidence of their allies' effectiveness. If a single Soviet sniper could eliminate over 300 enemy soldiers, what might properly equipped Soviet armies be capable of achieving? The visit helped pave the way for increased Lend-Lease aid and closer military cooperation between the two nations. During her time in America, Lyudmila also met with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, who became a close friend and advocate. Roosevelt was impressed by the young sniper's intelligence and determination, and the two women formed a bond that would last for years. Their friendship represented a powerful symbol of female solidarity across ideological and national boundaries, demonstrating that women could play crucial roles in the fight against fascism, but beneath the carefully orchestrated public appearances and diplomatic victories, Lyudmila was struggling with the psychological aftermath of her combat experience. The transition from the brutal realities of warfare to the polished world of international diplomacy was deeply disorienting. She found herself haunted by memories of fallen comrades, plagued by survivors' guilt and uncomfortable with the celebrity status that had been thrust upon her after her successful tour of the United States. Lyudmila continued her propaganda mission with visits to Canada and Britain, where she received equally enthusiastic receptions from audiences eager to meet the legendary Soviet sniper. In Britain, she was received by Winston Churchill himself, who was reportedly fascinated by her tactical knowledge and her first-hand accounts of German military capabilities. These meetings provided valuable intelligence to Allied planners, while further cementing the international alliances that would prove crucial to ultimate victory. But as 1943 began, Lyudmila found herself facing a difficult transition back to life in the Soviet Union. Her celebrity status had made her too valuable to risk in combat, but too psychologically damaged by her experiences to return to civilian life. Soviet authorities assigned her to a training role where she would pass on her deadly skills to a new generation of snipers who would carry on her work across the Eastern Front. The training facility where Lyudmila was assigned was a closely guarded secret, hidden deep in the Ural Mountains where German bombers could not reach. Here, carefully selected soldiers from across the Soviet Union came to learn the deadly arts that had made their instructor the most feared sniper in military history. The students were both male and female, though the women faced additional challenges in proving themselves worthy of the elite training program. Lyudmila approached her teaching duties with the same methodical precision she had once applied to eliminating enemy soldiers. She developed comprehensive curricula covering not just marksmanship, but also camouflage, fieldcraft, psychological warfare, and survival techniques. Her students learned to think like their enemies, to predict human behavior under stress, and to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities that could turn a single sniper into a force multiplier, capable of demoralizing entire enemy units. Perhaps more importantly, she taught them about the mental aspects of their deadly profession. Combat sniping, she explained, was as much about psychological endurance as physical skill. Students had to learn to cope with isolation, to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, and to live with the knowledge that their survival depended on their ability to kill other human beings with cold precision. Many of her students would go on to achieve legendary status themselves. Women like Nina Lobkovskaya and Aliya Maldagyulova would rack up impressive kill counts while serving on various fronts, carrying forward the tactical innovations and psychological insights that Lyudmila had developed during her own combat service. Male students like Vasily Zaitsev would become household names, their exploits celebrated in books and films that would immortalize the deadly effectiveness of Soviet snipers. During this period, Lyudmila also began working on her memoirs, attempting to capture not just the tactical details of her combat experience, but also the emotional and psychological journey that had transformed a university student into one of history's most effective killers. The writing process was therapeutic, but also deeply painful, forcing her to confront memories she had tried to suppress, and to analyze the person she had become during those brutal months in Odessa and Sevastopol. Her memoirs revealed a complex individual who struggled with the moral implications of her actions, even as she took pride in her service to her country. She wrote about the faces of enemy soldiers she had killed, wondering about their families and the lives they might have led if not for the war. But she also wrote about the civilians she had saved, the strategic objectives she had helped achieve, and the comrades whose lives had been preserved by her deadly interventions. As the war progressed, and Soviet forces began pushing German armies back toward Berlin, Lyudmila watched from afar as her former students applied the lessons she had taught them. Reports filtered back from the front lines telling of spectacular sniper victories, of enemy officers eliminated at impossible distances, and of German morale crumbling under the constant threat of invisible death. Each success validated her training methods and demonstrated the lasting impact of her contributions to the war effort, but victory came with its own challenges. As the tide of war turned decisively in favor of the Allies, Lyudmila found herself grappling with questions about her post-war future. What role was there for a legendary sniper in a world at peace? How could someone who had been trained to kill with mathematical precision adapt to the mundane challenges of civilian life? These questions would plague her for years to come. The end of the war in Europe brought mixed emotions for Lyudmila. On one hand, she felt tremendous pride in having contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of her homeland. The enemy forces that had once placed a massive bounty on her head were now either dead, captured, or fleeing in complete disarray. The propaganda machine that had portrayed her as a bloodthirsty monster had been silenced forever. But victory also brought a profound sense of loss. Many of her closest friends and comrades had not survived to see the end of the conflict. The cities where she had fought her most famous battles lay in ruins, their civilian populations decimated by years of brutal warfare. The Soviet Union had won, but at a cost that would take generations to fully comprehend. As she contemplated her legacy, Lyudmila realized that her true achievement was not just the 309 confirmed kills that had made her famous, but the broader impact she had made on military doctrine, international diplomacy, and the role of women in combat. She had proven that deadly effectiveness in warfare was not limited by gender, that intelligence and determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, and that individual courage could inspire entire nations to greater efforts. In the aftermath of World War II, Lyudmila faced the challenging transition from legendary warrior to peacetime citizen, a journey that would prove almost as difficult as her original transformation from university student to deadly sniper. The Soviet Union was rebuilding from the devastating losses of the war, but for someone whose identity had become so closely tied to combat effectiveness, finding a meaningful role in this new reality presented unique psychological and practical challenges. The Communist Party recognized her continued value as a symbol of Soviet achievement and female empowerment. They arranged for her to complete her interrupted university education, and she eventually earned a degree in history. Returning to the academic pursuits that had originally defined her before the war changed everything. But the classroom, discussions of ancient battles and historical strategies seemed pale and abstract compared to the brutal realities she had experienced firsthand. Her post-war career combined academic work with continued service to the state. She became a researcher at the Soviet Navy's headquarters, where her analytical skills and deep understanding of military tactics proved valuable in peacetime strategic planning. She also served as a consultant for military training programs, helping to institutionalize the sniper techniques and psychological insights she had developed during her combat service. But perhaps her most important post-war role was as a keeper of memory. As the Soviet Union began to grapple with the enormous human cost of the war, Lyudmila became an important voice in ensuring that the sacrifices of her generation would not be forgotten. She gave lectures at military academies, spoke at memorial ceremonies, and worked with historians to document the experiences of Soviet snipers during the conflict. These efforts took on increased importance as the Cold War developed and Western accounts of World War II began to minimize or ignore Soviet contributions to the Allied victory. Lyudmila's story served as powerful evidence of Soviet military effectiveness and individual heroism that challenged Western narratives about the war. Her international fame from her 1942 American tour gave her a unique platform to present the Soviet perspective to global audiences. She also became an advocate for veterans' rights and support services, drawing on her own struggles with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The psychological wounds of her combat service never fully healed, and she understood better than most the challenges faced by soldiers attempting to reintegrate into civilian society. Her advocacy helped establish programs that provided both practical support and psychological counseling for veterans dealing with the aftermath of their wartime experiences. As the decades passed, Lyudmila watched as her wartime exploits became the subject of books, films, and countless articles. Some of these portrayals were reasonably accurate, but many were sensationalized or romanticized, versions that bore little resemblance to the brutal realities she had experienced. She was particularly critical of depictions that focused primarily on her gender rather than her tactical skills and strategic contributions to the war effort. The Cold War period brought its own complications for someone with Lyudmila's international profile. While she remained a loyal Soviet citizen, her experiences in America had exposed her to different perspectives and ways of thinking that sometimes put her at odds with official party doctrine. She had to navigate carefully between her personal convictions and the political requirements of her public role, a balancing act that required the same kind of strategic thinking she had once applied to eliminating enemy targets. Her relationship with Western veterans and historians was particularly complex. Former German soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front sometimes sought her out, hoping to understand the legendary sniper who had terrorized their comrades. These encounters were often emotional and difficult, forcing her to confront the human cost of her wartime actions while also defending the necessity of her service in defending her homeland. One particularly significant meeting occurred in the 1960s when a former German officer named Hans Müller contacted her through intermediaries. Müller had served in the siege of Sevastopol and claimed to have been one of the counter-snipers, specifically assigned to hunt her down. He had survived the war, but had been haunted for decades by memories of the phantom killer who had seemed to strike from everywhere and nowhere. The meeting between former enemies was arranged in neutral Vienna, with both parties accompanied by translators and government representatives. What could have been a confrontational encounter instead became a remarkable dialogue about the nature of warfare, duty, and survival. Müller expressed his professional respect for Lyudmila's tactical skills while acknowledging the terror she had inspired in German forces. She, in turn, recognized his courage in seeking her out and his willingness to confront the past. Their conversation revealed the complex humanity that existed, even within the brutal context of World War II combat. Both had been young people caught up in historical forces beyond their control. Both had done their duty as they understood it, and both had carried the psychological scars of their experiences for decades afterward. The meeting helped both veterans find a measure of peace with their wartime service. As the Soviet Union began to change during the Gorbachev era, Lyudmila found herself able to speak more openly about her experiences and to engage with international historians working to create more complete and accurate accounts of the war. She participated in conferences and symposiums where former enemies could meet as scholars rather than combatants, contributing to a more nuanced understanding of the Eastern Front and the role of snipers in modern warfare. Her insights proved particularly valuable for military analysts studying the psychological aspects of combat and the factors that contributed to individual effectiveness under extreme stress. Her ability to maintain peak performance while enduring months of life-threatening conditions provided important data for understanding human resilience and the mental qualities required for success in high-stress military roles. As Lyudmila entered her later years, she became increasingly focused on ensuring that the lessons of her generation would not be lost to history. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought dramatic changes to her homeland. But it also created new opportunities to share her story with audiences who had previously been inaccessible. Western publishers and filmmakers who had long been interested in her experiences now had unprecedented access to Soviet archives and the freedom to tell her story without Cold War political constraints. She worked closely with historians and journalists to create accurate accounts of her wartime service, insisting on precision and factual accuracy over sensationalism. Having lived through decades of propaganda and mythologizing, she was determined that future generations would understand both the heroic and tragic aspects of her experiences. Her collaboration with Western researchers helped produce some of the most detailed and accurate accounts of sniper warfare during World War II. One of her most important late-career projects was mentoring young Russian women who were interested in military service. The post-Soviet Russian military was grappling with questions about female integration and combat roles, and Lyudmila's example provided powerful evidence that women could excel in the most demanding military specialties. She argued passionately that gender should never be a barrier to serving one's country, and that individual capability, not stereotypical assumptions, should determine military assignments. Her influence extended beyond military circles into broader discussions about women's rights and capabilities in Russian society. During the tumultuous 1990s, as traditional gender roles were being questioned and redefined, Lyudmila represented a powerful example of female achievement that predated Western feminist movements. She had proven her capabilities in the ultimate test of skill and courage, and her example inspired countless women to pursue careers and opportunities that might otherwise have seemed impossible. International recognition of her achievements continued to grow throughout her later years. Military museums around the world began displaying exhibits about her service, and her rifle and other personal equipment became prized historical artifacts. Military academies in multiple countries included case studies of her tactics in their curricula, ensuring that future officers would understand the principles and methods that had made her so effective. Perhaps most significantly, her story began to be told in ways that emphasized the broader lessons rather than just the spectacular kill count. Modern military analysts recognized that her true genius lay not in her marksmanship, though that was certainly exceptional, but in her ability to think strategically, adapt to changing conditions, and maintain peak performance under extreme psychological pressure. These qualities were relevant far beyond the specific context of World War II. Sniper warfare. Her final years were marked by a series of honors and recognitions that acknowledged not just her wartime service, but her lifetime contributions to military science, international understanding, and women's advancement. She received honorary doctorates from universities around the world, was inducted into multiple military halls of fame, and became the subject of academic conferences dedicated to studying her tactical innovations and psychological insights. But perhaps the recognition that meant the most to her came from the surviving veterans of World War II, both Soviet and Allied, who acknowledged her as one of the war's most significant individual contributors. Men who had served in the most elite military units and had witnessed extraordinary acts of courage under fire consistently ranked her among the most impressive warriors they had encountered. This recognition from her military peers validated not just her tactical skills, but her place in the pantheon of history's greatest soldiers. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in 1974, her passing marked the end of an era. She had witnessed the transformation of warfare from the brutal close-quarters combat of World War II to the nuclear standoffs of the Cold War. She had seen her homeland rise from the ashes of devastating war to become a global superpower. And she had played her own small but significant role in that transformation. Her funeral was attended by veterans from around the world, former enemies and allies united in their respect for a warrior who had embodied the highest ideals of military service. The ceremonies included full military honors, but also academic tributes that recognized her contributions to military science and historical understanding. She was buried with the same rifle she had carried through the battles of Odessa and Sevastopol, a fitting tribute to the weapon that had made her legendary. Today, more than 50 years after her death, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's legacy continues to inspire and educate new generations. Her story is taught in military academies as an example of tactical excellence and psychological resilience. Her example continues to challenge assumptions about gender and capability in military service. And her life remains a powerful reminder that individual courage and determination can make a difference, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds. The young woman who had once filed paperwork in a Kiev office and transformed herself into history's deadliest female sniper proved that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary achievements when circumstances demand it. Her 309 confirmed kills represented not just tactical victories, but victories of human spirit over seemingly impossible challenges. In the end, the paperwork lady became something far more significant than a deadly sniper. She became a symbol of what human beings can achieve when they refuse to accept defeat. Her story reminds us that heroes can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that dedication and skill can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and that individual actions can have far-reaching consequences that echo through history. In a world that often seems dominated by forces beyond individual control, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's life stands as testament to the power of personal courage and determination to change the course of events. But the story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko doesn't end with her death in 1974. In fact, in many ways, her most profound impact was yet to come. As the decades passed and new conflicts emerged around the world, military strategists and historians began to recognize that her innovations in sniper warfare had fundamentally changed the nature of modern combat. The techniques she pioneered during those brutal months in Odessa and Sevastopol became standard doctrine in military academies from West Point to Sandhurst, influencing generations of soldiers who would never know the name of the young woman who had developed the tactics that kept them alive. Her psychological warfare methods proved particularly prescient. In an age of social media and instant global communication, her understanding of how fear and uncertainty could be weaponized against enemy forces became more relevant than ever. Modern military psychologists studying the impact of individual operators on large-scale conflicts consistently point to Pavlichenko's example as a blueprint for asymmetric warfare, how a single skilled individual can create effects far beyond their apparent capabilities. The technology of warfare evolved dramatically after World War II, but the fundamental principles that made Lyudmila so effective remained constant. Her emphasis on patience, precision, and psychological manipulation became the foundation for modern special operations doctrine. Elite units like the Navy SEALs, British SAS, and Israeli Mossad all incorporated elements of her methodology into their training programs. Though few realized they were following techniques developed by a former university student who had learned to kill Nazis with mathematical precision. Perhaps even more significantly, her example continued to break down barriers for women in military service long after her own combat career had ended. When the United States finally began integrating women into combat roles in the 21st century, military planners repeatedly cited Pavlichenko's record as evidence that gender was irrelevant to combat effectiveness. Her 309 confirmed kills remained an unmatched achievement that no male sniper had equaled, providing irrefutable proof that biological sex had no bearing on tactical capability. Modern female snipers serving in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones often carried photographs of Lyudmila in their equipment, drawing inspiration from the woman who had proven decades earlier that they belonged on the battlefield. Her example gave them confidence to push through training programs designed to eliminate the weak and her tactical innovations helped them survive in environments where a single mistake meant death. The rifle she carried through the siege of Sevastopol eventually found its way to the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, where it became one of the most visited exhibits. Tourists from around the world would stand in silence before this simple weapon that had ended so many lives and changed the course of history. Military professionals examining the rifle noted its lack of special modifications or advanced technology. It was the same basic equipment available to thousands of other snipers, proving that Lyudmila's effectiveness came from her mind and training rather than superior equipment. In recent years, declassified German archives have revealed the full extent of the impact she had on enemy operations. Documents show that entire German divisions were forced to modify their tactics because of her presence, that supply operations were rerouted to avoid areas where she might be operating, and that morale reports consistently mentioned the psychological effect of the mysterious Soviet sniper who seemed to strike from impossible distances. The cumulative effect of these tactical changes may have delayed German offensives by weeks or months, potentially saving thousands of Allied lives. Modern ballistics experts who have analyzed her confirmed kills continue to be amazed by their precision and difficulty. Computer simulations using period-accurate equipment suggest that many of her shots should have been impossible given the technology available at the time. These analyses have led to new respect for the skill levels achieved by World War II snipers and have influenced modern training programs that push students to exceed what was previously thought possible. Her personal story has also taken on new relevance in an era when ordinary citizens are again being called upon to defend their homelands against foreign invasion. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine saw Ukrainian defenders explicitly invoking Pavlichenko's example, with social media posts showing her photograph alongside messages about defending their homeland against fascist aggression. Her transformation from civilian to deadly warrior resonated powerfully with people who found themselves in similar circumstances. The academic world has also continued to find new insights in her story. Sociologists study her experience as an example of rapid role transformation under extreme stress. Military historians analyze her tactical innovations for lessons applicable to modern asymmetric warfare. Psychologists examine her ability to maintain peak performance under life-threatening conditions for extended periods. Her life has become a case study in human adaptability and resilience that extends far beyond military applications. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to her legacy is the simple fact that her story continues to inspire people to exceed their own limitations. Every time someone faces seemingly impossible odds and refuses to give up, every time an individual proves that determination can overcome superior resources, every time someone transforms themselves to meet extraordinary challenges, they are following the example set by a young woman who decided that filing paperwork was not enough when her homeland was under attack. Lyudmila Pavlichenko proved that heroes are not born, but made, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, and that individual courage can change the course of history. Her transformation from the paperwork lady to Lady Death stands as one of the most remarkable personal journeys in military history, a reminder that within each of us lies the potential for greatness if we have the courage to seize it. The girl who once sat behind a desk managing administrative tasks became a legend whose story will be told for generations. And in the end, that may be her greatest victory of all, not the 309 enemies she eliminated, but the countless lives she continues to inspire long after her war has ended. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.